Chapter 9. After Badger's Visit. Toad could hardly wait until the next day, when it would be his counselling session. He was hopping mad. Appropriate for a toad, he thought, in a lighter moment. "Just wait until I tell Heron," he said to himself. "He'll never believe it. He won't credit it that Badger came to my house uninvited and tried to get me to give up my school governorship. Badger had better not show his face here again in a hurry, or it'll be the worse for him. I'll show him." However, it must be understood that this anger and frenzied activity were going on within Toad. Such feelings and such anger! But there were no external signs by which the outside world would have known just how strongly he was feeling. By the evening his anger had subsided, and he was once again in his usual unhappy state of mind, feeling sad and miserable. "Badger's right after all," he thought. "He would make a much better governor than me. He's got such drive and determination. They probably only made me a governor because I live here at the Hall and they can use the garden for their summer fete." That night he slept badly and woke early. When he went to the heronry on the following day, he was feeling low and miserable. Heron ushered him in and said, "Morning, Toad, and how are you feeling?" "Bloody awful," answered Toad, who did not usually use bad language, but felt this last trace of anger blow over him like the tail end of a hurricane. "Why don't you tell me about it?" asked Heron. And so Toad told him the sorry tale of Badger's visit, and how he had wanted Toad to resign from the school committee. "So how did this make you feel?" asked Heron. "Terrible," answered Toad. "I don't seem to be of much value to myself or to others. I've just about definitely decided to resign and send my letter to the vicar. It will be the best for everyone." Heron remained silent for some considerable time. It was not that he didn't understand Toad's situation. He understood it only too well, but he was uncertain which path of learning to pursue. Eventually he spoke. "Toad, I have to congratulate you. You play a very good game." Toad looked up, bemused. "Game? What game? I'm not playing a game." "I suggest that you are," answered Heron. "You play a very good game of plom." "Plom? What on earth is that?" asked Toad. "Plom stands for Poor Little Old Me, and you win it every time. Or lose. It depends all on your point of view." "I really don't understand what you're talking about," said Toad peevishly. "I am not playing a game. I've told you in all honesty about a very unpleasant situation which has befallen me, and you say I'm playing a game with you?" Toad looked at Heron reproachfully. "Honesty is an interesting word," said Heron. "Are you saying I'm dishonest?" said Toad, beginning to feel angry. After all, his family motto was, "Guard thine honour." "Yes, I think I am," said Heron surprisingly, "but not in the usual sense of the word. I think you can be dishonest with yourself. Why do you keep getting into situations where you end up looking stupid and someone gets the upper hand and you feel like a poor little child again? Is it just wretched bad luck, or do you in some way collude in the process?" "What does collude mean?" asked Toad. "It means a secret agreement. I use collude to mean that you secretly or unknowingly cooperate with others to create your own unhappiness. That's why psychological games are played. And the losing is in the winning," said Heron enigmatically. "Now look here, Heron," said Toad strongly, as he tried to resist these ideas. "There is no collusion, as you call it. I never knew Badger was going to call or ask me to resign, and I want to remain a governor. It all came out of the blue. So how could I have cooperated with him, secretly or otherwise?" Toad was clearly very upset. Then Heron made what was the closest to an apology Toad had ever heard from him. "I'm sorry, Toad," he said. "I obviously have not made my point well, or else you are not yet ready to explore this particular idea. You feel that I'm accusing you, and nothing could be further from my mind. So may we leave that point and come back to it later?" "If you say so," answered Toad rather huffily. "But I shall want to hear more about these so-called games. I take it that there are others you think I play?" "Yes, I think there probably are," replied Heron. "But if you are feeling so defensive, you will not be able to analyse them now. I think we should move on." There was a pause as Toad realised he was feeling extremely strongly about the things Heron had just been saying. Yet he wasn't sure why. "All right," said Toad, "but you may be right. I felt very hot under the collar when you said that about colluding and wanting to make myself unhappy. It seemed so stupid that I should try to make myself miserable." "Look, Toad," said Heron, "some of the ideas which arise in this work can initially seem silly or illogical or even frightening. And those ideas that are most likely to provide the deepest personal insights are those most likely to be strongly resisted." "Why is that?" asked Toad. Because they threaten our equilibrium the most, answered Heron. They are the ideas that are most likely to lead to personal change at a deep level, and that is often painful, as I think you are discovering. When we look at ourselves, we do not always like what we see. To move from where we are now to where we would like to be must inevitably involve changes in our behavior and our attitudes. To achieve this requires hard work, courage, and determination. So you can see, Toad, why you might resist opening a door that could lead on to such a difficult path.
But it could also lead to great understanding, said Toad quietly.
Of course, said Heron, and that is why we are working together, travelling on the same path. There was a long pause as they sat together in a companionable silence. Shall we move on now? Asked Heron eventually. You had been telling me about Badger's visit and how he made you feel. So let me ask you this question. What kind of state do you think he was in when he called on you?
He certainly was not in the child ego state, for sure, said Toad. It's hard to believe that he was ever little. He always reminds me of my father.
Well done, Toad. I believe that you are exactly right. In fact, Badger was in the parent ego state.
And what exactly is that? Toad asked.
When we are in the parent state, we behave like our parents. Remember, they were the first people we ever experienced, so their influence on us is immeasurable. The parent state contains all the values and morals we have learnt from them since birth. It contains our standards for living and enables us to say what we believe to be good or bad, right or wrong. These values originated from our parents, who were the main influence on our behaviour. Their words and actions moulded our early years and inevitably influenced the rest of our lives.
So, do you think that Badger's parents would have been stern moralists, and that's why he believes as he does? Asked Toad.
It's very likely, answered Heron. But remember this, Toad. We are never simply a clone of our parents. Whilst they have enormous influence on us, our own personal uniqueness ensures that we are not just copies of our mothers or fathers, but individuals in our own right. So, he continued, what other behaviour would you expect to see in someone who is in their parent ego state?
The way they look, do you think? Asked Toad. I'm thinking of my own father. He could look very stern and displeased at times.
Right, said Heron. And how did he sound?
Angry. He could either be quiet and cold and icy, or he could be loud and frightening. I'm not sure which frightened me most.
Can you think of other examples of people you have met who were in their parent? Heron asked.
Toad thought for a bit. Yes, I have come across other people like that. Certainly some of the masters at my school. He paused. When you start to think about it, you come across examples of it all the time. For instance, I went to the cricket ground the other day to see how the preparations are going for the Saturday match. Our groundsman, who's a surly old so-and-so, was painting the white lines on the crease. I went up to him for a chat and asked him how he was getting on. He looked at me in the eye and said, I was doing all right until you came along. I felt very uncomfortable.
Heron smiled. That seems like a very good example. Any others?
Yes, there is one that comes to mind, Toad replied. I can still feel angry when I think about it. I went to the dry cleaners the other day to take a number of bow ties to be cleaned. They had got rather grubby, soup stains, that sort of thing. The lady behind the counter took one look at them and said, You don't want dry cleaning, you want a bib. The cheek of the woman.
Heron smiled. Once again, he said, I think you're on to something important. Let's write it up. He went to the flip chart and wrote the heading, The Parent Ego State. Underneath he drew a circle and divided it in half with a vertical line. In the right half he wrote, Critical Parent. Now, Toad, he said, what words would you use to describe someone in their critical parent state?
Well, I think we have mentioned them already, Toad replied, and he took the crayon and wrote, Judgmental, Angry, Severe. I suppose there are lots of others, he said.
I'm sure there are, answered Heron, but I think these encapsulate the critical parent. Toad sat down and looked at the words which he had written. After a while he said,
Heron, there's something I don't quite understand.
Can you put it in a question? Asked Heron. That usually takes the learning forward.
I'm not sure that I can initially, Toad replied. You see, what you've just told me about this parent ego state has really opened my eyes. For instance, it helps me explain Badger's behaviour so well. When he came round to my house, almost everything he said was critical or judgmental. No wonder that he reminds me so much of my father. Knowing what I know now, I can almost predict what Badger will say when we next meet, and how he will behave.
Excellent, said Heron. You are clearly developing your emotional intelligence."
I am?
asked Toad in surprise.
Certainly, said Heron.
Intelligence is not just a matter of IQ. We need EQ as well.
Well, said Toad, I don't feel very intelligent about my next question, which is this. Where's my critical parent? You said everyone has got one, and it derives from what our parents said to us and how they treated us when we were little. It certainly helps to explain the way Badger and other people behave. So what about me? Where's mine? I honestly don't think I've got one. I hardly ever get angry. That's really true, Heron. I don't get angry with people. I don't tell people off. I don't shout at them or criticize them. In fact, it's usually the opposite. I see the best in them and encourage them. It makes me sound a bit weak, I know, but that's how I am.
There was a long pause before Heron spoke. Toad, are you ready for some more personal learning? I mean learning at a deep level. Toad looked steadily at Heron.
Yes, I am, he said, but it hurts sometimes, you know. I'm getting many new insights, but I don't always like what I discover.
I know, said Heron sympathetically, but remember what they say, no gain without pain.
I find that kind of saying particularly annoying, answered Toad with some spirit. You usually find it written on calendars with pictures of seagulls and rose-coloured clouds. Trite, or tripe.
Be that as it may, answered Heron in what Toad thought was a slightly pompous manner, let us try to find the answer to the problem you have posed. Perhaps we can clarify it by writing it down. He went to the flip chart, found a fresh page, and wrote the following. Does Toad have a parent ego state? Then he said, now, let's write down some of the parameters of the problem. And he wrote, 1. Everyone has a parent ego state. 2. There seems no evidence that Toad has one. Then he turned to Toad and said, so what should be our next question?
Clearly, the next question must be, answered Toad, why haven't I got one?
I think there's a more logical question than that, said Heron.
What is that? asked Toad.
We could ask, how does it operate? Toad thought for a moment. Eventually he said,
I don't understand. I thought you agreed with me that I don't have a parent state, so how can it operate?
I don't agree that you don't have one, in fact, said Heron. I believe that you have a very powerful one. The question is, how does it work? It's clear that it operates in a very different way to Badger's.
You've got me really confused, said Toad. I don't know where I am.
I think confusion is often the first stage in the learning process, said Heron. It happens when fixed boundaries begin to unfreeze. You start to be confronted with new data that challenge existing beliefs and behaviour. It can be the beginning of creativity, the anxiety that drives the process of change. Toad looked unconvinced by Heron's explanation.
I don't feel like that, he said grumpily and ungrammatically.
So let's try thinking about this problem in a different way, said Heron. Let's think of this parent state as more like a judge who is seeking to accuse someone, find them guilty, and then, quite logically, punish them. Does that make sense to you, Toad?
It certainly does, he said.
Do you think that Badger behaved like a judge yesterday?
Oh, definitely, said Toad. That's just how he was, and I feel like the prisoner at the bar. I can speak about this from experience, you know. It's terrible to be found guilty, but it's even worse to feel guilty.
So who do you judge, Toad?
That's just the point, said Toad irritably. I don't. I'm not that kind of person.
Toad, said Heron, may I invite you to think again and ask yourself the question, who do you judge? There was a long, long silence. Then Toad said in a small voice,
I think I see what you're getting at. Do you mean that I judge myself?
Heron sat quietly and said nothing. After some time Toad spoke.
Then I suppose I find myself guilty and condemn myself, is that it?
There can be no stronger criticism than self-criticism, and no harsher judge than ourselves, answered Heron.
Oh dear, said Toad. Do you mean we can punish ourselves?
Severely, said Heron, including torture and, in extreme cases, execution. But the problem is that, even if the sentence is light, it can be imposed for life.
So what can I do? asked Toad. I've got a lot of life in front of me. I don't want to keep punishing myself, if that is what I do. I'd like a bit of happiness. What can I do, Heron? Can you help me?
It may sound a little stark, Toad, but it is you and only you who can help yourself. There are lots of questions that you should consider. For instance, can you stop judging yourself? Can you be kinder to yourself? And perhaps the most important question of them all, can you start to love yourself? Toad sat still, completely motionless. After a while, Heron said, "Are you all right, Toad? It's time to go."
"Yes," he replied. "I'm all right, but you've given me so much to think about, my mind's buzzing. I feel quite light-headed."
"So be careful going home," said Heron, "and I will see you next week." Then he added, "Toad, do look after yourself." And Toad walked slowly down the path and through the gate.